That is. Yeah, I can find that. Dive the mic. There we go. Actually, let's do this. That way I have this up. There we go. There we go. Okay. That's a door, and I just bashed my knee on it. Alright. I think that's all set up. Now to pull up my thing, showing me what I was doing. Alright, let's do this. Close out the VM, open up this. Alright. Do I need MNT? Wonderful. Oh, there's. Okay. Let's do this. Let's open up a newer version. See if the newer version has that file. this. R2 cluster, F2P, Motorola, Motobridge, 4.8, OMC, ISO. We already have more information. Target is busy. I don't think it here. Let's do this. What if I completely eject this? Let's just reboot that. Alright, media DVD drive, insert this. 4.8. I don't know where those files are coming from. That's an issue. Question is did it actually install?
contents of the disk is right there for the taking to transfer over to your PC. The thing is, this isn't how groups ripped disks at all. There was another method with a cheap DVD drive and a PC years before the popular drive to rip Xbox disks known as Creon drives even existed. Now, because release groups were racing each other to get their releases out faster than the competition, the use of an original Xbox to rip games and upload them was just not an option. It was just much too slow. As we will see shortly, there are much easier and faster methods to get your game ripped and released out into the internet. But before we do that, let's take a look at the Xbox game disc itself. As with almost all optical disc-based console hardware, the original Xbox DVD was protected from duplication. On first glance, the disc appears to be a normal DVD that's readable by a regular PC DVD drive. When you insert an Xbox game disc into a PC, however, a video plays. When we try to read the contents of the disc, only the video files are displayed. The actual game content is nowhere to be found. So what's going on here? Quite simply, each Xbox game disc, or XGD, has two partitions on the disc. The first is readable only on a PC. The second is locked away and hidden, which is enabled when you insert the disc into an original Xbox console. To explain this further, when you insert an Xbox DVD into a PC, once the lead-in is read, the disc becomes user accessible. PC DVD drives use logical block addressing, or LBAs, to specify where data lives on the drive. After the disk lead-in, the video partition begins at LBA 0 all the way up to LBA hexadecimal 30600. Then the game partition area begins at that position all the way to the lead-out of the disk. But the table of contents that contains the information about the total number of sectors on the disk only returns information about the first partition, or the video partition. On an original Xbox, things are different. On a standard Xbox drive, it doesn't use LBAs at all. Rather, it uses physical sector numbers, or PSNs, from 0 all the way up to the end of the disk. When you insert an Xbox game disc into an original Xbox, after a challenge response authentication check, once authentication has succeeded, the drive changes its PSN offset for its mapping to the game partition and bypasses the video partition. So because release groups were racing each other to get their releases out faster, there were many tools and utilities that were developed by certain members of these particular teams. And one of them in particular is the Xbox DVD ripper that runs on a PC. Now, release groups quickly understood that the best and fastest way to get their rips out faster than the competition is to completely bypass an Xbox in the first place. In other words, just use a PC to rip your game discs and upload them. And that's exactly what they did. With a particular DVD drive known as the Hitachi GD5000 and a slightly customized firmware, the DVD drive is completely unlocked and allows the ability to rip Xbox original discs and Xbox 360 game discs as well. The Hitachi GD5000 is a very cheap 8x DVD drive that runs on a standard IDE bus. It was cheap back when it first came out, and it's still cheap and easy to pick up to this day. I'm not sure why release groups settled on this drive as the one to use, and I'll explain that shortly, but needless to say, this was the drive that all of the groups used. If you wanted to rip original Xbox discs fast, this is what you needed to get the job done. The GD5000 was also a very popular drive on Dell and Gateway machines. My old Windows 98 machine, for example, the Dimension XPS D266, comes standard with the same drive. Getting the GD5000 to read Xbox discs is simple. You'll need to install a modified firmware onto the drive one time. Once this is done, all you need to do is insert a game disc. Now you will note when you insert a game disc on Windows Explorer, it will still show the video partition only. But this is where the XBDVD read program comes into it. If you insert any Xbox game disc, and I'll use Fable for this example, and you run the command line XBDVD read program, it performs sector-based ripping of the disc, and after a while, the entire contents is ripped onto your hard disk, ready to package up and upload for those mad internet reputation points. Now, if we compare ripping Fable on the original Xbox, and then FTPing it over to the PC, it takes more than 3 times the amount of time. In the worst case, a disk with many files and many directories really slows down during the FTP process, so you can quickly see how this drive became the secret weapon of most reputable scene groups back in the day. This is how Project X released 60 of their games in 3 days, and why the Xbox scene became very lucrative for scene groups. So how does this XB DVD Ripper program work? Well, it's very simple. The Hitachi drive, like all DVD drives, has onboard RAM, and that's where information about the currently inserted disc would live. This RAM is not normally writable, but the Hitachi drive has a hidden command to enable this RAM to be written to. The Xbox Ripper code enables this RAM and patches the offsets of the LBA to be at the beginning of the game partition, and reads sectors from that all the way up to the end of the partition, including the DVD layer break. And that's it. It's very, very simple. This method probably works on many other DVD drives that have the same hidden command to access the DVD drive's RAM. As early as 2001, this drive was one of the biggest kept secrets in the original Xbox Underground scene and was a staple of all release groups at the time. It wasn't until around 2006 until Creon drives started to appear. The GD5000 also allows for the ripping of Xbox 360 game discs with a slight modification to the DVD layer break offset, which is in a different position than the original Xbox, but by the release of the Xbox 360, there was a much more refined method of ripping game discs. I do want to mention that I am releasing the utilities and the firmware that you saw in this video that I ran on the Windows PC out into the wild. So download it, take a look at it. Unfortunately, there's no source code available for it, but if anyone knows about this hack or was part of any release groups back in the day that's familiar with this, I'm sure there's some folks out there that watch this video and you have access to source code. I'd be very interested, even just for preservation's sake, having that source code would be really cool to have available, and hopefully it can help other of Xbox said XNA Game Studio That infamous quote was made by Chris Satchell, who was working for the Xbox Advanced Technology Group in 2005. In part 1 of this series, we covered the Xbox 360 and how the DVD drive was targeted by hackers with custom firmware code that exploited the drive to run backup games. While this method proved to be very popular, it did not open up the system for homebrew, which is what thrived on the original Xbox for many years before. The DVD exploits, as clever as they were, only allowed for piracy, which meant that there was no ability for the homebrew or Linux community to take advantage of the system. If we compare the Sony PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, both share similar specifications, but the PlayStation 3 came out of the box with a Linux distribution, a sandbox for the development of homebrew called OtherOS. The Xbox 360, on the other hand, had nothing for the bedroom coder to play around in. Microsoft had promised the homebrew community to open up the Xbox 360 to allow for the development of homebrew, but this ended up in the form of XNA Game Studio Express. In 2006 at the launch, Peter Moore, then Vice President of Xbox, said, "XNA Game Studio Express is our first step of creating a YouTube for video games. It will give you everything you need to bring your games to life on the Xbox 360. XNA Game Studio Express was a welcome addition to the Xbox 360, but it wasn't what the homebrew community was looking for. It's essentially a framework of portable libraries that require C#.NET that allowed you to build games on Windows and run them on the Xbox 360 or Windows phones. It only allowed restricted access to the hardware, and while there were some really cool games developed for it, some of which have become successful such as Bastion and Dust: The Elysian Tale, it also required a $99 membership fee per year, and it certainly would not allow you to run Linux. OtherOS on the PlayStation 3 came with the console and was free of charge. The Xbox 360 was several times more powerful than the original Xbox, and came with 8 times the amount of RAM. This meant that it should make for a significantly better homebrew device for media players, emulation, and homebrew games. Many of us from the OG Xbox days, if you were around in those days, wanted to see homebrew on the Xbox 360 as the natural progression of things. But it was clear that Microsoft had invested so much time and money into the security system of the Xbox 360 that it wasn't going to be easy. And we found out very quickly that things were going to take a lot longer than anticipated. Given this, the motivation to exploit the Xbox 360 was high. There must have been a way. but Microsoft had spent millions securing the hardware. Here's a quick summary. The boot process of the Xbox 360 has a secure chain of trust, and this time, all of it is contained inside the physical CPU itself. Unlike the original Xbox where it was possible to snoop data along the bus, nothing is sent over the bus at all. Furthermore, the Xenon CPU contains a unique key that's tied to the console itself, as well as eFuses, which would enforce updates by blowing a fuse, and this meant that you could never downgrade back to a previous version. The Xbox 360 hypervisor sits in RAM, and it's only 128 kilobytes in size. It will only ever allow for signed code executables to run, signed that is, with Microsoft's private key. All runtime memory is encrypted, and there's no way to alter RAM, and there's certainly no way to execute it. But if you can somehow get access to the hypervisor, you can have full control of the machine. With current gen gaming, it's hard to believe anymore, but the Xbox 360 had 18 games at launch. Some were cross-gen titles with the original Xbox, others were sequels to popular franchises, and some were new IP. One game in the launch lineup that was popular was Peter Jackson's King Kong. It was a fun first-person adventure title and easy achievement points. It was worth a playthrough just for that. Although the Xbox 360 game executables are signed, game assets such as level data, textures, models, audio, and shaders are not. This meant that a game that may have had an exploitable asset may open up the door for code execution on the system. But even if you did have an exploitable asset on the game, wouldn't the hypervisor shut it down anyway? Well, yes and no. Microsoft shipped the Xbox 360 in November of 2005, but in October of 2006 with the version update 4532, a bug was introduced that would allow for complete system control. How did this happen? One of the main tasks of the hypervisor is to handle all system calls, in other words, calls to kernel mode functions. In the update 4532, an exploit was found that would make it possible for the hypervisor to system call into user memory and execute code. This is what was known as the King Kong exploit. The exploitable shader on the game was patched to load arbitrary code with full privileges and access to hardware. But if you had to modify a shader on the game disk to launch unsigned code, that would mean that you would need to use a backup copy of the game, which would not boot on a retail Xbox 360. But there is a simple workaround to this. A hacked DVD firmware that boots backups would easily handle this. The King Kong exploit was developed in November of 2006 but was not disclosed publicly until February of 2007. Microsoft had already been made aware of the exploit and it was patched even before it was announced to the public. And because of eFuse technology, there was no way to go back to this firmware after you had updated. The King Kong glitch was a good first step, but it was discovered too late. All was not lost, however. In fact, far from it. One of the chips in the Xbox 360 is known as the SMC or System Management Controller. This is a fairly common chip with most home computers. It controls all the power functions, controls the fans, handles system resets and various other commands. The Xbox 360 also had a JTAG port for the GPU and CPU. JTAG is an interface that's used for programming and debugging, but for security reasons, both the GPU and CPU JTAG ports are very quickly disabled during the boot sequence. But if we draw our attention back to the SMC, it's possible to override this disabling of the JTAG ports and apply a timing hack to bypass the eFuses and load kernel 5532, the same kernel as used by the King Kong exploits as before, but without requiring the original game disk. This was all done before the bootloader could shut down the JTAG port. This process would normally make the GPU become unstable, so as part of this process, the system is soft rebooted. From here, the system boots up to a patched kernel and hypervisor, which enables the use of Homebrew. To explain how this timing attack works in more detail, the base kernel comes shipped with all Xbox 360s and is always present. When a firmware update is applied, it's essentially appended onto the base kernel rather than overwritten. This is likely for security reasons. To deal with the problem of not being able to downgrade to 4532 due to burnt eFuses, if the Xbox 360 CPU key is known, then it can easily bypass this check. This timing exploit works by extracting the base kernel and patching it with the current firmware. This would still not boot because the system would show the current version. The firmware is checked against what's known as a lockdown counter, a check to determine the number of eFuses that are still available. This corresponds to the kernel version. This value is encrypted, but it's only 16 bytes long. Therefore, to determine a hash lockout counter value that matches the base kernel's only requires 4096 tries to decrypt the hash and allow this modified kernel to boot. Custom hardware was designed, and in conjunction with the SMC enabling the GPU and CPU JTAG ports would open up the King Kong exploit once again without requiring the game or the shader as from before. This exploit is known as the JTAG hack. It rendered all Xbox 360s before December 2007's update to be vulnerable. But around the same time, Microsoft updated the hardware with the Zephyr, Opus, and then Jasper models. All of these were patched against the timing hack. In early 2008, Microsoft had completely patched the JTAG exploit. If you had a JTAGable Xbox 360, you were in luck. But only a very small group of users compared to the entire user base were using JTAG Xbox 360s. It was also much harder for the average user to mod their Xbox 360s as it required multiple steps and more chances of failure. Coupled with the red ring of death issues, it meant that many users chose to keep away. After Microsoft fixed the JTAG exploit, it seemed as if that was it. No more hacks. A few false starts, but Microsoft seemingly had won the battle. However, in August of 2011, a new exploit appeared out of nowhere. This time, it was a brute force attack on the CPU's thread management code, which is stored in the CPU itself. The exploit works by first setting the Xenon CPU's clock speed to the lowest possible so that it would still run signed code. This was performed by the scaler chip, known as the HANA, which has the CPU speed control built into the chip itself. Now, in this scenario, the Xbox 360 would normally think that there was a problem, and after 3 attempts to boot into the kernel, it would shut itself down. But the exploit allows the system to retry as many times as needed. The CPU has a reset test point, which is then used to quickly reset the processor, and this is where the exploit comes in. Like any CPU, when it's executing code, it's running an active thread. But by adjusting the timing to reset the CPU every 100 nanoseconds, on successful reset the active thread and registers are cleared out, and when the thread is dropped, the system perceives this as a successful status check and then proceeds to run modified code and take over the system and ultimately gain hypervisor access. Known as the RGH or reset glitch hack, it breathed new life into the Xbox 360 homebrew scene and worked on all model Xbox 360s except for the older Xenon models. The RGH method, however, is not perfect. The main issue is that it's slow, and in some instances there is a significant wait time for the Xbox 360 to glitch. Sometimes it never happens at all, and you must power off and try again. The RGH method was refined into the RJTAG method, which takes the same JTAG bootloaders from the King Kong days and combines it with the CPU thread drop exploit and use more sophisticated FPGA hardware to manage the exploit itself. And as of the making of this episode, the RJTAG method is still unpatched. Now, I do want to mention there are other exploit methods that came out after the reset glitch hack, including the RJTAG that we touched on. In general, they're just iterations or tweaks or little differences of the original exploit discoveries themselves. There's really nothing new that has been discovered since the reset glitch hack itself, and I don't anticipate that that will change in the future, considering that the Xbox 360 is all but a dead system in 2019. The reset glitch hack ultimately brought homebrew to all. No longer did you need to resort to using an older JTAGed Xbox 360, which had elevated risks of red ring of death. The developer of the RGH, known as Gleekly, also worked on open source ports that ran under Linux, known as libxenon. From here, work was done on bringing Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast emulation across to the Xbox 360. As for the homebrew scene itself, it wasn't as prominent as the original Xbox days, but there were still some great things to play. You can still do some awesome things with a homebrew-enabled Xbox 360 even in 2019, and this will be covered in a future episode. Ultimately, it's unknown that if Microsoft gave homebrew developers what they were looking for, if this amount of discovery and work to defeat the hypervisor would have occurred. The PlayStation 3 seemingly was secure enough, until other OS was removed, and that drove a targeted push to defeat its security within months of its removal. But to their credit, Microsoft did provide a better way to write code on the Xbox One that hobbyists could use with their dev mode, and one thing I'd like to see further refined in future generations of their consoles. So there you have it, guys. That's the story of the Xbox 360 hypervisor security that was ultimately defeated initially with the King Kong shader patch, which then was utilized in the JTAG exploit, as well as the reset glitch hack from 2011 that came out and really just kind of took over the exploit methods on the Xbox 360. Now, I did mention that there is a part 1 of this series. If you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link in the description below. It's all about the DVD firmware security that was ultimately defeated very, very quickly, actually, in early 2006, with lots and lots of custom firmwares that were really, one step ahead of Microsoft and trying to avoid things like Xbox Live bans and stuff like that. It's very much relevant to this discussion, and it does have some overlap in some of the exploits that were discovered, particularly around the King Kong shader exploit originally in 2007. Well, guys, that will do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. If you liked it, you know what to do. Give me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.
Alrighty, picking up where we left off, installing Red Hat, well, downloading Red Hat Linux, specifically version 4, because reasons. Um, yeah, we'll just go from there. Yes, I'm running this on Windows Server. Yes, I'm running this using Hyper-V. Yes, I know it's cringe. Deal with it. My server, my rules. And where's the music? Get the music back. Get it back. There we
It's been It's been said that DRM, anti-tamper, or anti-piracy measures are also anti-consumer. In other words, they hurt the end user more than they help. As an example, many PC games from older times simply won't run on modern PCs. Digital-only console games may get removed from digital storefronts due to licensing issues or simply because the storefront inevitably will shut down. It's true, however, that some of these issues have been addressed. Thanks to sites like GOG, who offer DRM-free versions of older games, usually running under DOSBox, which is a DOS and Windows emulator that plays nice with modern systems. And on the consoles, games from older generations may get a remaster or end up on a collection. But this isn't always the case. Many games simply will never be brought forward. But there is also another consideration. Games development is expensive, and if these DRM and anti-tamper measures weren't implemented, the argument is that it would account for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions in lost revenue. By simply making copies of games on CDs without protection may lead to reduced sales. And almost every development company out there has to deal with piracy, and different companies dealt with it in different ways, some more successfully than others. For a company like EA, they learned a hard lesson with the game Spore. A disastrous heavy-handed DRM measure forced users to download pirated versions in order to play the game that they actually paid for. If you were a PC gamer in the late 90s to 2000s, you were probably right at home with games coming on CD. Almost every game required the CD to be in the drive at all times. If you made a copy of the disc and tried to use the copy instead of the original, the game was usually smart enough to know it was a copy. And there was also CD virtual drives. An application known as Daemon Tools would install a virtual drive on your PC and allow you to mount an ISO image to it. Essentially, Windows believes that it was just another CD drive. But some CD anti-tamper DRMs were able to detect the presence of virtual drives. These DRM CD protections did not stop piracy. In response, the scene started releasing what was known as no CD cracks. Simple patches to the executable or game files to essentially strip out the CD authentication checks. While these cracks' main purpose was for piracy, of course, ironically, today, many of these no CD cracks are essential for playing vintage PC games on a modern PC. By the early 2000s, CD DRM measures had become increasingly sophisticated. A Russian company known as Protection Technology released a new DRM that was known as Starforce. At a glance, this just looked like another CD authentication check protection mechanism, but in reality, it was anything but. Before Starforce, most CD-based protection was essentially a key or digital signature pressed onto a disk that was impossible or very difficult to copy. Starforce used a different approach that was multi-tiered. First of all, the executable and many of its game files were encrypted. Each master disk has individual physical parameters that are unique to each disk that's pressed. Those parameters make up a unique 24-byte key. That key is also embedded into the executable and files of the game. The protection simply is if the physical parameters of the disk match the key embedded in the executable and the disk is in the physical drive, the game will pass its protection check and boot. Simple enough? Starforce began appearing in games as early as 2003. By 2005, it was at its third revision, and Splinter Cell Chaos Theory by Ubisoft took over 400 days to crack. This was unprecedented. Anti-piracy methods like Secu-ROM and SafeDisk were annoying enough for most end users, but they were easily defeated by hackers pretty quickly and easily. But Starforce was something else entirely. With over 400 days to crack Splinter Cell Chaos Theory on the PC, this was a next level form of protection. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how it actually works. Since the early days of Windows NT, there has been security implemented in all Windows operating systems. Just like something like Linux, where you have user administration and even root level access, Windows has a similar thing, tiers or levels of privilege known as rings. Ring 3 is user or application level, so any utility, game or code you write will run at this level. Rings 1 and 2 are generally not used by Windows, and Ring 0 is the kernel level, the highest tier, where you have unrestricted access to the entire operating system, the keys to the castle if you will. We mentioned earlier that StarForce gathered the native physical parameters of the CD. In order to achieve this, StarForce would silently install a device driver in Windows known as the StarForce Protection Driver, and depending on the version of StarForce, something else known as a VFS driver, which we'll come back to in a minute. Early versions of StarForce would install these drivers on the target machine at Ring O level, with full and unrestricted access to the user's machine and hardware, which did not even inform the user. As you can imagine, this was a cause for some concern. It's also worth noting that most games contain a EULA or End User License Agreement, which outlines the agreement between the user and the license in place. There is no mention of StarForce in any EULAs in any games that supported StarForce. But let's go back to the protection. The VFS driver is for the virtual file system. StarForce creates a small virtual machine on the target machine which can contain one or many of the game data files, which are usually encrypted. Essentially, any StarForce game can be running in real mode, then access the virtual machine to decrypt and read files from, and then return back to real mode. There was no universal standard on how protection was established. It varied from game to game and was extremely difficult to crack. In the past, for Securom, there were generic patcher tools. In this case, it would simply not apply for StarForce. Attempting to crack StarForce was very challenging. Generally speaking, a hacker would use a debugger that could access the kernel or at the Ring O level. Soft Ice was a very popular kernel debugger at the time. But the crackers relied on using a method known as int3. By sending an interrupt to the debugger would temporarily replace an instruction in a running program in order to set a breakpoint. This meant the hacker would get a good look at the running code and come up with ways to bypass protection checks. StarForce would simply check for those interrupts and redirect them elsewhere to throw the debuggers off. In fact, int3 was used as part of the protection itself. Make no mistake, StarForce was some of the best anti-piracy, anti-tamper that was ever created. But this all came at a cost. End users started to learn about what StarForce was doing to their PCs, installing device drivers at the highest level of privilege with no real understanding of what it was doing is an absolute red flag. Worse still, uninstalling games that use StarForce such as Race Driver 2, Broken Sword 3 and Silent Storm did not remove StarForce itself. The problem was StarForce left lots of residual files behind and it wasn't an easy task to clean all traces of the DRM off a machine, and in the end a dedicated StarForce removal tool was developed for this purpose. Then there was the problem with the dual CD-ROM drives. If you had more than one CD drive connected, StarForce would not pass its authentication check unless you physically disconnected one. StarForce was also included on many game demos. The reasoning was that the game companies did not want hackers referring to the demo to find clues on how to crack the main game when it came out. Many users started reporting issues with their PCs after StarForce protected games were installed. Complaints about slow CD-ROM speeds, blue screens of death, random reboots, and more were common. The company denied this, but because of the kernel level access to the system meant that these crashes could not be ruled out. It was found out that StarForce would sometimes step down the IDE speeds and in some cases even disable DMA or direct memory access of the CD-ROM drive. This meant that you could no longer play audio CDs, for example. This was also confirmed by PC Gamer magazine editor at the time, Greg Vetterman, who stated,
"Last year my work PC suddenly began blue screening anytime I popped an audio CD into either of my two optical drives. I went online and learned that other people were having the same problem and that it appeared to be StarForce related. Deleting my StarForce protected games did nothing. I had to run a StarForce removal utility before my system, filled only with legal, licensed software, could play audio CDs again."
By 2006, the backlash for StarForce was immense, with many users and websites labeling it as a rootkit, malware, or even a Trojan. Users would often turn to the developers to ask for help with StarForce, only to be told that they should contact StarForce directly. At the time, Ubisoft was the largest publisher of games that used StarForce and was subject to a $5 million lawsuit.
Due to Ubisoft's intentional use of the highly controversial copy protection scheme StarForce, Despite user protests and purposeful deletion of any forum discussions about the protection, Christopher Spence has filed a $5 million lawsuit against the company for use of crippling DRM in their games. Starforce has been reported to cause system instability, slowdowns, and possible damage to optical drives, as well as questionable business practices when dealing with customers and other companies.
While the case was dropped due to lack of evidence, it didn't really matter. The public outcry and perception that this DRM was a rootkit spread like wildfire. Ubisoft ran a user poll on their forums, and the overwhelming response was against its use. Ubisoft then dropped Starforce in favour of the competition, Securom. But Starforce held firm, offering no apologies for their DRM methods. In fact, they went after and threatened lawsuits on people who spoke out against it. Cory Doctorow, whose website Boycott Starforce, was threatened with a lawsuit unless he removed the insults, lies, and false accusations. Starforce PR also sidestepped the Euler question by arguing that it didn't matter if Starforce was not explicitly mentioned. If you clicked I agree, then you are agreeing to it, even though it came installed as a hidden device driver. But to be fair, Starforce did later on reduce its privileges from Ring 0 to Ring 3 and listen to customer feedback. There is also questions about the validity of the claims causing problems to users' PCs. Starforce offered large sums of cash for people who could replicate problems that many had reported. These were never claimed. Most of these problems are addressed with the release of the Starforce removal tool. But the Starforce PR did not handle this well either.
According to our research, those of users that do run into compatibility problems are beginner-level hackers that try to go around our protection system.
What can't be questioned, however, is the underhanded approach. The hidden device drivers, the fact that it leaves traces behind, the uninstall utility was also called into question whether it cleaned everything up. End users began boycotting Starforce games because they just didn't want to deal with the problems and any potential issues on their PCs. The legacy left behind of Starforce is also worth mentioning. From Windows Vista onward, attempting to install a Starforce game, such as Peter Jackson's King Kong, would almost certainly blue screen, and in many instances require a complete reinstall of the operating system. It would also get stuck in repair mode, and safe mode would also not work. These issues were so bad that newer versions of most games like the Steam release of King Kong and Splinter Cell Chaos Theory had Starforce protection removed. But other games like Trackmania Sunrise simply cannot be played on a modern PC, and the game developers aren't interested in the removal of Starforce because it's a low priority issue. I should mention a couple of things. Starforce, the company, is still around today and they are quite successful in their security business. They don't really do copy protection for games anymore because obviously things like Denuvo have really taken that mantle as the kind of de facto copy protection standard on the PC these days. But Starforce is still around, the website is still up, and they do offer their services for copy protection mechanisms in different use cases. But it's interesting to see that they never really took much of a hit after the backlash from the PC and the loss of the Ubisoft deal as well. Now, the other thing I should mention is there is a really good write-up on the technical aspects of Starforce, and I'm going to tell you guys, I don't really know the intricate details of how the protection works and how it was cracked. There are some really interesting guides that you can take a look at to get more information on that. So I will leave a link in the description below to some really good guides and links that I think are useful if you are interested in learning more about the technical aspects of Starforce and how the protection was actually defeated. Well guys, we're going to leave it here for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, you know what to do. Leave me a thumbs up, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. The early days of PC gaming on DOS and Windows were great. Most games took up less than a single megabyte and could fit on a floppy disk. By the time Doom came out in 1993, VGA graphics were standard and game storage had increased. Games would come on multiple disks, as much as 5 or 6 for some of the larger games. Floppy disks were the main source of media storage. That is until 1993 when Broderbund released Myst, initially a Mac-only title, but it was a game that sparked sales of CD-ROM drives. And on the PC, the game Seventh Guest by Trilobyte was regarded as the killer app and was responsible for kickstarting the sale of PC CD-ROM drives and making it a standard. It was a multimedia experience like no other, and the CD revolution was among us. By the time Windows 95 was released, PC CD-ROM drives were standard on every computer that you would purchase in stores. But just like the consoles, games on the PC was no stranger to software piracy. Floppy disk games were simple to copy, even with unreadable sectors on the disk. Games were cracked in a matter of hours and spread around the world on FTP sites and bulletin boards. With CD-ROM games taking over as the standard, software publishers came up with different ways to stop end users attempting to duplicate or make copies of the discs. During the first few years, this wasn't a problem, but as CD burners were first revealed in the mid-90s, although initially expensive and slow, it wasn't long before they became affordable and a part of any standard PC setup. One of the earliest forms of CD-ROM copy protection was to press CDs with more data than a regular CDR could hold. A standard CD holds around 700 megabytes of data, but some games came on discs that held more data. This meant that you couldn't copy the entire disc. This approach was flawed for two reasons. The first is usually that the extra data found on the disc was just filler and could have just been removed and a normal size CD was burnt anyway. The second was that CD burner technology was improving at a rapid pace and was capable of what was known as overburning the additional data and make a copy of the disk anyway. Another approach was to use what was known as a fake table of contents. Like floppy disks, CDs contain metadata about the size of the disk, the files contained on it, how large they are, their timestamps, and more. This information is known as the TOC, or table of contents. Some games introduced a fake table of contents to trick Windows into believing that the disk contained over 1 GB of data and confuse the CD writer into believing that it couldn't copy the disk. Tomb Raider 3 was one such game.
But these methods were crude implementations to stop casual copying, but dedicated cracking groups were able to circumvent these protection methods pretty easily. So companies started to innovate and get more advanced in copy protection. And one of the most infamous forms of copy protection that was released in the late 90s was known as SecureROM.
SecureROM was the next generation of CD disk protection under Windows and was originally introduced in the late 90s. It was one of the most well-known copy protection methods and was developed by Sony, which had a fabrication plant in Austria where they had technology that pressed CDs with data that could not be copied by CDRs. The security itself is straightforward. The mastering process assigns a unique key to each individual CD, which is stored in the sub-channel data. This key cannot be copied by a CD burner. When a game is started, it attempts to retrieve the key and use it to decrypt parts of the executable. If the key cannot be located or any other condition, then the SecureROM check fails. The disk must have been copied. It's also worth noting that the CD must be kept in the CD drive to launch the game, even though you installed it onto the PC's hard disk. While the method sounds simple and easy to bypass, SecureROM was a much more sophisticated system than anything else before it. The way that it was ultimately cracked is as follows. Remember, when you put a copy of a SecureROM game into a CD drive and boot it, it simply exits, it just won't boot. SecureROM, it doesn't actually use the Windows API function to access the CD-ROM drive. It triggers an interrupt from the Microsoft CD-ROM extensions, or MSC DEX. The executable contains encrypted code, and when launched, this code is decrypted with the unique key on the disk and modifies itself into memory. But how do you modify code that's already running? Self-modifying code is something that some games use in order to confuse and mitigate cracking attempts. With earlier operating systems like Windows 95, it was possible to modify any code resident in memory, which can be achieved by a simple Windows API call such as write process memory. A typical early SecureROM games calls write process memory 4 times on an original CD, but running a copy will only call it 3 times and fail. The earliest cracks essentially captured and decrypted output from these self-modifying calls, and by essentially replicating the decrypted output of the game by using a tool known as softice, the executable could be patched to return a 0 on write process memory, in other words success on every single call, and just apply the decrypted output inside the executable. This meant that the game could start without a CD in the drive. These were known as the no CD cracks, and because a secure ROM CD contains no unreadable tracks on the disc, it meant that you could make a copy of the disc and then download a no CD crack for the game and play it that way. As with all anti-tamper methods, Secure ROM had problems. Sometimes, even with an original disc inserted, it would not detect that the disc was in the drive. And in the worst case, it would just flat out not work at all with certain CD drive brands. There was really no way of knowing. It didn't take long for Secure ROM cracks to start coming out, and while each game required its own crack, otherwise known as a no CD crack, Secure ROM itself was far from done. In fact, the company really doubled down on its product and started to introduce online authentication on top of the existing Secure ROM CD checks. By the early 2000s, many people had internet access. Secure ROM began introducing online activation DRM on top of existing CD checks. These early versions were simply to validate that a legitimate key was being applied to the game. But by the mid-2000s, all that was about to change with one of the biggest PC releases to date. Will Wright was the developer of SimCity and The Sims. In 2005, he announced Spore, a real-time strategy god game that allowed the player to begin life as a microscopic organism and journey all the way through interstellar exploration and beyond. Its massive scope, procedural generation, and open-ended sandbox style appeal to many, especially strategy game enthusiasts. The game was a life simulation and Will Wright was at the helm. It even included music and sound produced by the legendary Brian Eno. The game suffered multiple delays during its development cycle. Perhaps it was too ambitious, but was ultimately released in 2008 to generally positive reviews. Although the consensus was it may not have lived up to the hype, it was still a good game. Not so good, however, was the Secure ROM. Spore had one of the most heavy-handed and frustrating online activation DRMs that left many users unable to play the game. And keep in mind that Spore is a single-player game. Publisher Electronic Arts proudly announced that Spore would earn more in revenue by reducing piracy of the game and stopping the second-hand market. When the game was released, it required online validation every 10 days. But due to the massive outcry, this re-authentication was quickly dropped. Each legitimate copy of the game used a key that could only be authenticated on up to 3 computers. So even if you uninstall the game on all of your computers, attempting to install a 4th time would fail. And it was also noted that the game needed to re-authenticate on the same system if some hardware was changed. For example, if you replaced your graphics card or RAM, it would constitute a different computer. In response to these complaints, the cap was raised to 5 computers, and after 5 activations, then you would need to contact customer service, who may or may not have granted further activations based on your situation. Secure ROM was also not disclosed on the box, and in September of 2008, a class action lawsuit was filed against EA regarding the disclosure of the DRM, which at this point ran just like a rootkit and remained on the hard drive and was very difficult to remove even when the game was uninstalled. In the end, the DRM was cracked, and Spore ended up as one of the most pirated PC games to date. Within the first week of release, it was already downloaded over 500,000 times on torrent sites. Maxis developer Chris Harris labelled Secure ROM on Spore a totally avoidable disaster. EA had learnt their lesson from the whole situation and began selling the game with the Secure ROM completely removed, but 4 months after the release of the game is a lifetime, and sales by this point had slowed down to a trickle. The DRM completely killed off the game. It never stood a chance. But Spore was not the only game. Secure ROM with online activations were also used in popular EA titles including Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. And fast forward even to the last 5 years with the release of Windows 10, which still causes headaches for Secure ROM games. Microsoft considers early DRM like Secure ROM a security flaw, and will not allow the games to be read from CD. Recall earlier that we said that the code modifies itself by attaching to its process and patching bytes. That's something that's a big no-no in Windows 10, so any Secure ROM disk will simply not run without a no CD patch. Microsoft themselves consider Secure ROM a vulnerability, but the game publishers seem okay with providing customers with an unhappy experience in the short term to ensure that the first week of sales aren't affected, but don't consider the legacy of a game that you may want to replay 10 years later. It just may not even work anymore thanks to the heavy-handed DRM measures. And I guess the last word should be, if you bought and own a Secure ROM game, you will always continue to have issues, and you have my condolences. Thank God for GOG and no CD cracks.
So there you have it, guys. That's the story of Secure ROM, the very heavy-handed DRM protection that started out as a CD copy protection mechanism and kind of transformed into this online activation DRM that really backfired for EA when Spore was released, and it really hurt their sales more than it helped, and it was something that provided a poor user experience, and in the end it was just easier just to download a crack of the game and run it and enjoy it that way versus having to deal with customer support, activations, and things like that. And as we've seen, you know, Electronic Arts still continues to use online activation DRMs, although not Secure ROM, because Secure ROM is no longer around the company, but those techniques.
Alright, well, I've spent too much time on this. It's been almost 2 hours. I'm going to go ahead and go take a nap. So, yeah, we'll pick this up tomorrow. I'm going to leave it to install um, while I'm at work, and we'll go from there.